Okay, lecture 3.2, the science consensus on climate change. The purpose of this particular lecture is to outline for you how the consensus that scientists have reached on climate change. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to explain to somebody else the agreement or consensus scientists have reached on climate change. What do the majority of scientists believe is to be true about climate change, and how that is communicated. And then the second purpose is for you to start to understand the basics of the Paris Agreement on climate change, which has obviously been very much in the public eye this summer. So we have some key terms for this particular lecture. One we've already introduced, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We talked about last lecture. We will talk about that again today. IPCC. We will also, another key term is the IPCC's assessment report, and this particular one we'll be referencing today is the fifth assessment report. The other two key terms are the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Okay, so the big takeaway for this lecture and for this entire module, and actually this entire course, is there is overwhelmingly strong scientific consensus that the global climate is changing and that human activity contributes significantly to the changing climate. There is also strong scientific consensus that human-induced climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions, and those greenhouse gas emissions are stemming from human behaviors such as all industry processes and manufacturing, our transportation, our agriculture, and other vital components of our economy. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, is one of the major bodies of scientists who study the data and report conclusions to the rest of the scientific community, to governments, and to the public regarding climate change. It is an international body of scientists housed within the United Nations, and its job is to objectively and scientifically analyze data related to the climate and climate change and communicate that information along with political and economic impacts of that information. So what the IPCC does is it produces reports that summarize climate change research. It does not do its own research. It is not a scientific research body in the sense that it doesn't, design experiments and carry out the experiments. It also does not monitor the climate. So it doesn't collect data in terms of temperatures and carbon dioxide levels, etc. It simply collects all the various studies and reports and data that is out there related to climate change, reads it, objectively reviews it, summarizes it, and reports this data back to provide us with a sense of what is the consensus on climate change. The IPCC consists of thousands of scientists and other experts from throughout the world. They are all working on these reports on a voluntary basis. They are not paid. And they really are what most consider to be the internationally accepted authority on climate change. They produce these reports, which have the agreement of leading climate scientists and consensus of participating governments. And actually, in 2007, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded in two parts, one part to the IPCC and the second part to Al Gore and for his work on climate change. So one of the major outcomes of the IPCC are their assessment reports. The last assessment report was published in 2015, and it is the IPCC fifth assessment report. And it is what happens whenever one of these reports are published is the scientists just pull literature from scientists all over the world and data from all over the world on what's happening with climate and the climate and the effects, and the IPCC pulls that all together, synthesizes it so that we have updated, synthesized knowledge on the scientific, technical, and socioeconomic aspects of climate change. So it is a usually very massive report. It comes out in parts. Fortunately, we can get summaries and syntheses, and they have a very good website as well that provides us with this information. So in 2015, when they released the fifth assessment report, there were a number of very important conclusions that came out of that assessment report. I have the three sort of probably key conclusions up here. The first one is that unequivocally, they agreed, these thousands of scientists unequivocally agreed from all over the world that our atmosphere and our oceans are warming. They also agreed that there is very clear evidence that human behavior is influencing our climate. That means that it's not just a natural cycle that we're in right now where the earth is naturally warming, and in fact humans are influencing that warming. The other major conclusion was, with between 95 and 100% certainty, the scientists concluded that it is extremely likely that humans have been the dominant cause of our global warming that has happened since the year 1950. So thousands and thousands of scientists from around the globe have come up and agreed upon these important conclusions. When people say no, climate change isn't happening, what evidence do they have? What facts do they provide to back that up? And then the second thing is more speculative. Why is it that people are resistant to accepting that the climate is changing and that it's humans that are causing it? So respond to those two questions. Pause the PowerPoint if you need to. Go back and forth between the two slides so that you can see the questions. And then before you proceed with the rest of the lecture, I'd like you to stop, email me your responses, and then come back and finish up the lecture. Okay, so as I've said throughout this module, we are going to proceed with this course with the assumption that climate change is real and that it's largely being driven by human behaviors. There is enough comprehensive scientific proof of current and potential future climates to clearly indicate that climate change is real, that it's largely attributed to emissions from human activities, and that it is a very serious problem. More than 97% of scientists who have looked at this issue agree that climate change is happening and that it's happening because of humans. So think about it this way. You're having excruciating pain, the kind of pain that leaves you unable to do or think about anything else. And so you naturally want to get the right treatment and you want to feel better. So you go to one doctor and that doctor says you're going to need surgery. Well, before you actually go get the surgery, you decide it would be a good idea to go and get a second opinion from a second doctor. So you've had two opinions. They've both said you should have surgery. Now repeat that 98 more times. If 97 of those doctors told you that you needed surgery, and that 3 of those doctors told you, no, you don't need to do anything, what would you decide to do? Within the scientific community, there is overwhelming consensus that man-made global warming is happening. According to a very recent survey, 99.99% of authors of peer-reviewed scientific studies on climate change between the years 2013 and 2014 agreed with that statement. And every major national academy of science in the world agrees that man-made climate change is happening and that it is a real threat to humanity. If 97% of your doctors diagnosed you with a serious illness, would you listen to that 3% and skip your treatment? Of course you wouldn't. The same is true for climate change. 97% of our scientists are telling us it's happening. We need to do something about it. So what is causing the remaining 3% to continue to have an influence and a voice within our society? Here is a selected list of scientific organizations just in the United States alone that have published statements articulating their belief and their consensus on climate change. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, American Chemical Society. You can go to climate.nasa.gov/scientific-consensus for a full list of US-based entities that agree that climate change is happening. On a worldwide level, we have over 200 scientific organizations that agree that it's happening, and the complete list I've provided for you can be seen on this slide as a hyperlink. So that would be my argument to anybody who would tell me that it's not real, that it's a liberal conspiracy, that there is evidence that it's not real, etc. I would just refer them back to the scientists who study this and know what they're talking about and believe that it's real and that it's being caused by humans. All right, so that's sort of the scientific consensus on climate change. The last few slides here, I wanted to talk to you about the Paris Agreement on climate change because it has been in the news. We've heard that our president has voiced that he is going to be withdrawing from the Paris Agreement on climate change. And so I thought it would be prudent to talk about what is the Paris Agreement and what the US withdrawal actually means. So in the year 2015, there was a conference in Paris. It was the UN Climate Change Conference, and it was held over a period of a couple weeks in France, and we actually had quite a few people from K-State who participated in that conference. And at the end of the conference, the people who were there had negotiated the Paris Agreement on climate change, which is what has been in the news so much lately. So the Paris Agreement on climate change is a global agreement to reduce climate change by doing basically two things. Peaking our emissions, so getting to a point where instead of our greenhouse gas emissions continuing to go up, 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 up every year, get to a point where we reach the peak and we start to see a decrease in emissions. And the second major aspect of that is to figure out a way to, within the second half of the 21st century, be at a point where we are neutral in our greenhouse gas emissions. So the Paris Agreement now has the commitment of almost every country in the world. A total of 195 countries agreed and signed on to the agreement. 147 of those countries have ratified the deal, meaning they formally agree to abide by the rules. They are the people that have ratified it are legally obligated to the rules. The 195 parties that signed the agreement have given their verbal agreement, but not their legal agreement. And essentially, the key agreement that all of these countries agreed to was that they would work together to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. So we do not want to see our global average temperature increase by any more than 2 degrees Celsius. Within the Paris Agreement, a couple of things that I think are really key and important for everybody to understand as we try to understand what is the role, what the implications are of the United States withdrawing from the agreement. First of all, it's key for everybody to understand that within the Paris Agreement, every country determines, plans, and regularly reports what it is going to do to mitigate global warming, to slow down, to stop, to change global warming. There is no mechanism in place to force any country to set a specific target by a specific date. The only thing that is said is that your targets for greenhouse gas emissions should be more stringent than previously set targets. There's also no mechanism in place to say that you can't, as a country, change what you have agreed to do at any point in time. So basically, the Paris Agreement can be renegotiated on a country-by-country basis at any point in time with no legal, economic, financial, political implications. And actually, from the very beginning, the Paris Agreement was drafted with the United States legislative process in mind. I think this is very interesting. For example, one of the reason that it's actually called an agreement rather than a treaty is because in the United States we interpret the word treaty as something that requires Senate approval. And that's something that would have been impossible with a Republican-controlled Senate. We would have never gotten Senate approval if it had been called a treaty. So an agreement can be approved simply through an executive action by the president, and so that's why it was called an agreement. The legal shape of the Paris Agreement was also crafted with the United States in mind. The various elements of the deal carry different levels of legal weight. One particular quirk of the agreement is that the deal legally obliges countries to prepare climate targets, but not implement them. So if you are a signed member of the agreement as a country, you are required to have targets for greenhouse gas emission reduction, but you are not required to implement those targets. This is also another requirement that was put into the agreement as a way to avoid any type of Senate involvement within the agreement. So, some very interesting things about the Paris Agreement that help us understand the discussion that's currently happening within our country. So, sort of thought it was interesting that I was preparing these lectures as we were hearing a lot of talk about the Paris Agreement, because these next few slides sort of summarize a lot of the arguments that you were hearing in the media and in the press over the last few weeks. So 5 questions about the Paris Agreement, and I'll try to answer them. So the first question I hear a lot of is, I'm in favor of action on climate change, but isn't there a trade-off between the Paris Agreement and the economy of the United States? So what I like to tell people is actually quite the opposite is true. Most business leaders and economists agree that the Paris Agreement is actually very good for the American economy. In a series of letters to the president, executives from many of America's largest corporations, everything from Apple to Cargill to Coca-Cola to Walmart to some large oil companies, all advocated to continue U.S. participation in the Paris Agreement. You might ask why? Well, a strong Paris Agreement means that all countries are working towards the same climate goal that levels the playing field for American manufacturers. It creates new markets abroad for climate-friendly technology like solar powers, energy-efficient appliances. And so these CEOs of all these companies also argued that the agreement provides much needed certainty for planning long-term investments, and it will reduce climate-related risks. So basically what they're arguing is that acting now on climate change is our best insurance policy against the most harmful impacts of climate change that we will see in the future. And we've seen this before. When the world back in the 1980s agreed to phase out ozone depleting chemicals, American chemical manufacturers led the way. They led the charge and they developed ozone safe replacements. And their businesses benefited as a result. So today, American companies could actually take the lead on climate action on a worldwide basis if we had legislative support and governmental support to help grow businesses in that area. So another question I often hear is, well, I care about the climate, but there's other things about the destruction of nature that concern me more. Why should the Paris Agreement be such a priority? Well, I would say one of the main causes of global climate change is the destruction of our natural environment, and the two things go hand in hand. For example, deforestation and unsustainable land conversion for agriculture are very closely tied to climate change. Deforestation on a global level destroys about 13 million hectares of forest every year. That's about the size of North Carolina being destroyed every year. And every time you chop down trees, you chop down something that is actually removing carbon dioxide out of the air. So the more trees we lose, the more carbon that remains in the atmosphere. So really, yes, we're concerned about nature, we're concerned about water, we're concerned about biodiversity, but all of these things are tightly tied to our climate system. Third, I also hear a lot of arguing that the Paris Agreement is really a Democrat issue, it's a partisan issue, that we need to start to find common ground between the Democrats and the Republicans. This is something that in recent months we've heard a lot of. However, if you've been paying attention and listening and reading to the news, political leaders from both the Democrats and the Republicans have actually been supportive of the Paris Agreement on many levels. There's been very well-known Republicans who have been very loud vocal advocates for the Paris Agreement. Our current U.S. Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, has publicly stated he believes that we should stay in the Paris Agreement. Even major American coal companies have advocated to stay in the agreement. And basically their sort of reasoning is that the United States has to keep its seat at the table in order to be able to advocate for American interests on a global scale. And when we withdraw from an agreement like the Paris Agreement, we're removing ourselves from the table. We're going to be left out of conversations. So it has become a partisan issue, although it really shouldn't be a partisan issue. Also, throughout the United States, if you ask an average citizen, most citizens are remarkably consistent on the Paris Agreement. Between 69 and 71%, depending on the poll, um, are supportive of the Paris Agreement, and this includes Republicans and Democrats. Then finally, the Paris Agreement is the most inclusive global agreement on climate change to date. We previously had accords like the Kyoto Protocol, which focused on cutting emissions from the developed world. But Paris, in contrast, was a global goal in which every country is going to contribute. It doesn't legally bind any one country to any one solution, and it allows individual countries to come up with their individual solutions while all working towards the same challenge. According to experts, the collective contributions put forward so far do not yet add up to what is needed to meet global goals, but the agreement was always designed to be a starting point, not an ending point. And experts point to provisions in the Paris Agreement that allows for it to just continually be improved upon. So how much does it really all matter? I remember when I was all upset about the United States withdrawing, my husband basically was like, well, calm down. It really doesn't matter that the United States has withdrawn. And basically his argument was that, yes, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement was a significant symbolic gesture on the world stage. In practical terms, what's actually a little bit more concerning is it's just one more step along the road of unraveling the United States climate commitments. What really matters for the planet is not whether the United States remains or in the agreement or not, but what matters is whether or not we are working on decreasing our greenhouse gas emissions within the United States. And within the United States, if we are committed to decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. Our current president has already made it very clear that he has little intention of trying to reduce carbon emissions. Obama set emission reduction goals of 26 to 28% over the next 50 years, and our current president has made it clear that he has no intention of trying to meet those goals. He's ordered a review of the Clean Power Plan and any regulations that he has labeled as being a burden to energy production, domestic energy production. He had an executive order that he signed called the Energy Independence Executive Order. And there's been a lot of news reports also of the Environmental Protection Agency being rewritten and reworded so that most mentions of climate change are gone or missing. So really, it's just a larger concerning picture in the United States right now. However, it's also worth bearing in mind before we get too depressed that the majority of United States emission reductions have really not been the result of climate regulations, but because we have switched from coal to natural gas. And that is going to just continue to happen. We're going to see more and more of our electricity being generated from natural gas. We're going to see, hopefully, more renewable energy sources of energy become more affordable. And that is what makes the difference in our emissions, not what our government regulates and requires. So the United States energy mix, where we get our energy from, how much of it's from coal versus wind versus natural gas versus solar, etc., is not determined by the Paris Agreement, and it's not determined by solely by Trump's energy regulations, but by economics and market forces and supply and demand, and that's all outside of our current administration's control. On the other hand, the Paris Agreement is not just about emissions reduction. The deal consists of many other elements that are designed to keep climate change in check and ensure that poor countries are dealt a fair hand. And so really what's probably more concerning is that by shutting itself out of the Paris Agreement, the US does not just withdraw from its own emission reduction commitments, but from just global cooperation on a range of important climate issues. So um, it's complicated. There's many, many facets and sides to all this. And if you would like to ask any questions, or if you have comments, or if you've read anything that you would like to share with me or the rest of the class, I would love to open it up to a larger discussion about the implications that this all has for us.